Hey everyone, before we dive into the story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. That way, YouTube will keep showing you more stories just like this one. Alright, let's begin. I make my living behind a steering wheel. I've been hauling freight long enough to know when a job feels clean and when it doesn't. Most weeks are the same loop. Pick up, deliver, fuel, sleep in the cab or a cheap motel, then do it again. I'm 44, divorced, and my place in Lincoln, Nebraska is basically a closet with a coffee maker. The work suits me. I like the steady pay and the miles. I like having a plan for the day and checking boxes until the sun goes down. In late November last year, I'd been running short hops around the state. Grain hoppers, palletized seed, and a couple of flatbed drops for a farm supply chain. Nothing out of the ordinary. Midweek, my dispatcher called with a rush run that would pay double if I could stage overnight and drop before sunrise. A broker I didn't know. Heartland Priority Logistics had a 3-crate shipment of irrigation turbine assemblies that had to go to a ranch north of Ord, out past where the pavement ends. The paperwork looked legitimate. The rate was more than fair. I said yes. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. A man who introduced himself as Mr. Keene thanked me for taking the load. He spoke fast. He wanted to be sure I had the address and the instructions. He repeated them twice. Don't stop at the house. Keep going past the corrals. The steel Quonset at the back of the property is where the forklift is. He told me they were expanding their operation and couldn't wait until morning to get the equipment under roof in case the weather turned. I've dealt with particular farmers. That isn't unusual, but he called again while I was still at the shipper to confirm my ETA. Then again when I hit Broken Bow. Same anxious tone, same reminders about the Quonset at the back. Urgency is normal when something is broken and a storm is coming. There was no storm in the forecast. I chalked it up to a man who worried about his business and kept rolling. The GPS got confused about 20 miles from the turnoff. The paved county road turned to gravel, and my unit bounced past pastures and shelter belts. Cell service dipped to 1 bar. The last lighted farmhouse I passed was a good 15 minutes before I saw the gate. A wooden arch spanned the entrance with Keene Homestead hand-carved into a board that had seen better decades. A chain hung across, but it wasn't locked. I killed my headlights for a second and took a breath. It was after 9. The only light on the property was a single window upstairs in the house, and another small glow in the distance where the Quonset should have been. I eased through the gate and crawled along the rutted lane. Cornstalks stood in dead rows to my left. To the right, a windbreak of cedars cut the wind to nothing. The house sat back from the lane. Curtains were drawn. No vehicles in the driveway. The instructions said to keep going, so I did. The Quonset was another quarter-mile back. An arched steel building with sliding doors. A halogen floodlight over the man door cast a narrow cone on packed dirt. A man stepped into that cone and lifted a hand. Tall, rope-thin, maybe late 50s, wearing bib overalls and a brown jacket. He had a headlamp strapped across his cap, and he kept turning his head like he was checking the tree line every few seconds. When I set the parking brake and climbed down, he was already halfway to the trailer. "Appreciate you making it tonight," he said. "We're in a bind. Need the capacity up by morning." His voice had that shaky energy people get after too much coffee. He said capacity and throughput a lot. It sounded more like a plant manager than a rancher. I asked where he wanted it, and he waved toward the open doors of the Quonset. "Just inside to the left," he said. "Forklifts in back. We can break the crates and hand carry some pieces. Less strain on your equipment." That last part didn't make sense. No one who knows equipment wants to disassemble pallets in the dirt at midnight. But the pay was what it was, and I wanted to go home with the ticket signed. I dropped the landing gear, chalked a tire, popped the straps, and we pried open the first crate. Inside were steel frames, gear housings, and a belt conveyor. It looked like farm hardware. Nothing about the parts themselves seemed wrong. We each took one end of a rectangular frame. As soon as we crossed the threshold, a different smell hit me. Not just oil and dust. There was something sharp underneath the usual shop odors. Cold metal and solvent, and something I couldn't name that made the back of my throat prickle. Only one bulb burned 20 or 30 feet inside. The rest of the building fell away into black. I heard a scuffing sound ahead of us. It wasn't an animal. It was a boot dragging across concrete, trying to be quiet. I stopped. He didn't. His voice got louder, like he was trying to cover the sound. "Just past the old stalls," he said, pointing into the dark. "Forklifts behind the compressor." My eyes adjusted. On the far side where the light didn't reach, I could make out shapes that weren't equipment. Shoulder height, human height, still silhouettes against the corrugated steel wall. One shifted the way a person does when their leg goes numb and they need to redistribute their weight. Another tilted. There were at least 4, maybe more. I set down my end of the frame and wiped my hands on my jeans. I told him I needed to check my airlines and dump the suspension before we took any more weight off the trailer. I said it calmly, like a driver who cares about his rig. His face changed. The jitter went out of his eyes and something flat slid in. He let the frame drop and it clanged against the floor. "We're almost done," he said. Different voice. "No thanks. No rush. Just a statement meant to box me in." I backed toward the door. If I ran, I'd trip or invite someone to grab me. I kept him in my sight while I tracked the shapes on the wall. "I'll be 30 seconds, I said. "Then we can use your forklift like normal." He stepped closer. His right hand disappeared in his pocket. His left hand lifted slightly like he meant to steer me deeper inside. Behind him, one of the figures knocked into something metal. The sound rolled through the Quonset and out into the yard. "I should look at the trailer," I said, and I walked into the night like I meant it. He followed. His stride got longer. I got to the step and started up. He grabbed my sleeve. His fingers were strong and the grip set hooks in the fabric. He pulled the other hand out of his pocket. There was a utility knife folded in his palm. I yanked my arm free and shoved him as hard as I could. He hit the trailer rail and gasped. I was in the cab, door slammed, locks down, engine turning over. 3 men came out of the Quonset at a jog. Heavy jackets, work boots, one with a length of pipe. Another had what looked like a short pry bar. The thin man, Keen, if that was really his name, jumped onto my running board and clawed at the handle. His face was right there in the window, teeth clenched, spit on the glass. He shouted that I couldn't leave with his property. I dropped it into gear and rolled. He held on for about 10 feet before he had to let go. The 3 men closed in. The one with the pipe swung at my mirror. The glass cracked and held. I kept the unit creeping forward and thought through my options. I could try to drag the trailer through the gate and pray I didn't jackknife on the ruts, or I could drop the trailer here and now and save the tractor. The numbers made the decision for me. I pulled forward far enough to clear the landing gear area, set the brakes, and threw the door open before they could hem me in. I grabbed my pin puller off the catwalk, yanked the release, and dumped the airbags. The kingpin slid free with a clank. I scrambled back in as footsteps pounded the gravel. The pipe hit the door and left a dent. The pry bar hit the lower step. I felt it under my boot as I floored it. The tractor lurched, freed of the weight. I swung wide around the Quonset and pointed at the lane. One of them tried to get in front of me. I didn't give him the chance. The gate came up fast, and I didn't lift. The chain snapped, and the crossbar splintered as the bumper took it apart. I didn't look back until I hit the county road. At the first fuel stop with lights and a camera, I parked under a canopy and called 911. I gave the operator the address, every detail I could remember, and told her I needed a deputy to take a statement. A Custer County cruiser pulled in 20 minutes later. The deputy was older, with a tired look and a mustache that said he had seen too many farm disputes end badly. He wrote down my account and looked at the cracked mirror and the fresh gouge in the door. He asked if I could describe the men. I told him what I could. Height, jackets, a cap with a seed company logo, and a limp in one man's right leg. He nodded, then told me something I already suspected. "By the time we get out there," he said, "you're not going to see what you saw. It'll be swept, doors closed, maybe a nephew in a different jacket. They'll have a story. You'll have a story. We'll file it and move on, but I'll go look." He did. He called me 2 hours later. He said the property was dark. He knocked. No answer. He found the broken gate and fresh boot prints in the yard. He found tracks where a tractor had been parked by the Quonset. He didn't find people. He didn't find a forklift or crates. He said he'd write it up and forward it to the state patrol in case similar reports came in. When I called my dispatcher at sunrise, he was already on the other line with the broker's number. It rang to a voicemail that didn't identify a company. He tried again. The email bounced. He dug deeper. The load confirmation had a routing number that didn't match the bank listed on the form. The credit card authorization was flagged within an hour as stolen. Heartland Priority Logistics didn't exist. The shipper address we'd picked up from was a real warehouse with a short-term lease under yet another name. I don't know how they arranged it. I do know the woman at the dock had a clipboard and a vest and a laminated badge. Everything looked ordinary because that's how it works. I went home and stared at my ceiling for 2 hours. Then I drove to the truck wash and got the dust off the tractor because that's what you do after a bad night. You make the equipment right and you keep moving. 2 days later, I sat at a counter in a truck stop on I-80 and talked to a driver I'd met on a different run. He was from Oklahoma City and hauled reefers mostly. I mentioned what happened without names and watched his face go grim. He told me about a cousin who disappeared after an urgent night drop to a closed cannery outside Amarillo. They found his trailer 2 counties away, and the tractor stripped in a yard behind a shuttered shop. He told me about a Facebook group where drivers compare notes on fake brokers and burner numbers. He told me to get a second phone just for brokers and a voice recorder app that starts when you answer. He told me to never follow instructions that say to ignore the house and go to the back. Once I started listening, the stories piled up. A warehouse in southern Missouri with a delivery at 2 in the morning and padlocks on every bay. A dairy in eastern Colorado that needed a pump after midnight and had 4 men waiting behind the milk tanks. A feedlot yard in Kansas with a receiver who insisted the driver back into a bay that wasn't wide enough and was positioned so a truck couldn't pull out fast if it needed to. In almost every case, the driver was new to that broker, or the broker was new to that lane. In a few cases, the driver didn't come back. I filed the insurance claim for the mirror and the door. I sent my statement to the deputy. I set new rules for myself. No night deliveries to unverified addresses. No back of the property drops without a legitimate contact who answers a corporate phone during business hours. If a rate is too high and the origin and destination are both one-off names, I pass. If a receiver calls more than once to make sure I'm coming and uses words like operation and capacity, but can't tell me the manufacturer of the equipment he ordered, I say no. There's always another load. A week after the incident, a blocked number called me 3 times in one afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. A man's voice thanked me for the attempted delivery and asked if I still had the crates. He said a different location might be more convenient. He gave an address near Norfolk. I gave the voicemail to the deputy and to my company. That was the last I heard of it. A month later, on a layover in Grand Island, I ran into a state trooper grabbing coffee. I told him in short what happened. He said they were hearing more about crews that lure drivers with fake freight, then take the tractor for parts or for a job, or worse. He said the outfits move around. He said they have lookouts at truck stops and they watch who rolls where. He said to keep records and keep my head on a swivel. He didn't promise arrests. He didn't pretend there was an easy fix. I still drive. I like the job, and I'm good at it. I'm careful now in ways I wasn't before. I added a cab camera that uploads to the cloud as it records. I added a release rope on my 5th wheel so I can pull the pin without leaving the step if I have to. I wear boots I can run in. I parked the trust that strangers get until they earn it. Every so often, I think about the men in that Quonset. I think about how quiet they were until they weren't. I think about the way the thin man's voice flattened when he realized I wasn't going to play along. People picture monsters as loud. The quiet ones are worse. They plan. They rehearse. They say we're almost done when what they mean is we're almost finished with you. Maybe there was never any irrigation turbine assembly. Maybe it was sheet metal and scrap. Maybe they never cared if I showed up on time as long as I showed up after dark. Maybe the upstairs light in the house was on a timer so it would look normal from the lane. I could turn that night over in my head forever and not know which details were decoration and which were the real tells. I didn't go back to see if the gate was repaired. I didn't drive that lane again to see if there were fresh tracks or a different name on the sign. Some things you leave alone. If I learned anything, it's that the money doesn't matter if the setup doesn't make sense. A good rate isn't a reason to ignore your gut. Someone telling you to drive past the house and into a dark building and break down equipment by hand at midnight isn't a receiver. He's a problem. There are honest night drops and real emergencies. You'll know them when you see them. Hospitals. Grocery DCs are trying to keep shelves stocked during a storm. A dairy with a compressor out when the temperature is soaring, and milk will spoil if they don't keep the chillers running. Those people have names and ID badges, and purchase orders with numbers you can call, and they don't mind if you park your bumper under a camera, or bring a coworker to stand with you while you unload. Sometimes I still wake up from a dead sleep with the image of that Quonset in my head. The one bulb, the shapes at the edge of the light, the smell I couldn't place. Then I make coffee and check the weather and roll in a different direction. The highway doesn't care about one field in the dark. There are towns and docks and receivers who will sign the bill and shake your hand when you come back in at a decent hour. If you drive for a living and a job comes across your screen that asks you to go where your gut tells you not to, you can say no. You're the one who has to climb out of the cab at midnight and carry the crate into the dark. You're the one who has to explain to your kids if you don't come back why the extra money was worth the risk. No one else will stand there in your place. I can't prove what would have happened in that building if I'd walked past the old stalls like he wanted. I don't need to. I've heard enough since then to know how those nights end. I was lucky. I saw what I needed to see while I could still drive away. And I did. I need to get this out because it's been eating at me since last month. I've been driving trucks for nearly 15 years, running mostly long hauls through the Midwest and the South. My name's David. I'm 46, divorced, no kids, and I spend more time on the road than anywhere else. Usually, I like it that way. The quiet stretches of highway suit me better than crowded cities. But what happened to me on Route 287 in Oklahoma made me seriously question if I'll keep doing this job. It was a Thursday night in mid-September. Dispatch had given me a load of medical supplies heading from Amarillo, Texas to Tulsa, Oklahoma. Nothing out of the ordinary, just pallets of boxed goods shrink-wrapped and strapped tight. I'd made this run dozens of times, though usually during the day. This time, to beat traffic and make the deadline, I left Amarillo just before 8 p.m., planning to drive through most of the night. The weather was clear, cool air, no storms on the radar. I remember feeling grateful it wasn't one of those muggy September nights. For the first hour, it was completely uneventful. I cruised along at around 68 mph, listening to an old crime podcast, sipping coffee from my thermos. The CB chatter was light. A couple of drivers talking about fuel prices and a way station near Wichita Falls. Nothing unusual. Then, a little past 9:30 p.m., just outside the small town of Boise City, I noticed headlights appear in my mirrors. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Trucks pass each other all the time, but these lights stayed perfectly fixed behind me. As they got closer, I saw it was a Freightliner Cascadia. Black paint job, glossy and spotless, like it had just come off the lot. No company logos, no DOT numbers, nothing. Just a solid black rig hauling a plain silver box trailer. It struck me as odd because almost no one runs completely unmarked out here, unless they're independent contractors, and even then you usually see at least a small decal. The truck was held about 300 feet behind me. Safe distance, professional, except as the minutes ticked by, it became obvious the driver was shadowing me deliberately. Every time I sped up slightly, so did he. Every time I eased down on the curves, he did too. It was like my truck was pulling his on a string. At first I brushed it off. Maybe he was just heading the same way, pacing his speed with mine. But after 30 minutes of this, my gut told me something was wrong. I flipped through the CB channels, just to check in, gave a casual call. Northbound on 287, anyone got their ears on? Static. No response. Switched channels. Same thing, nothing but low white noise. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Normally, you'll always get someone, even if it's just a bored driver complaining about the last rest stop coffee. I picked up my phone, thought about calling my dispatcher or even my buddy in Dallas, but the signal bars were gone. Dead zone. That stretch of 287 has plenty of them. So it was just me, the dark road, and that black Freightliner glued to my back bumper at the exact same distance, mile after mile. Around 10:15 p.m., I decided to test him. There's a wide pull-off just past a grain silo near Balco. I slowed down early, flicked my right turn signal on, and drifted toward the shoulder. In my mirror, I saw his right signal blink on too. Perfectly timed. I canceled my turn at the last second, pushed the throttle, and accelerated hard back onto the highway. His signal went dark, and like clockwork, he matched my speed, back to that same 300-foot gap. That's when my mouth went dry. This wasn't a coincidence. He was following me. For another 40 miles, he never changed position. Not once. The only lights on that lonely stretch of highway were mine and his. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and the more I thought about it, the more I remembered the stories other drivers told in truck stops. Stories I always thought were exaggerated. Rigs that stalk you for hours. Drivers who disappear. Hijackings where they find the trailer stripped, and the driver never shows up again. I'd laughed at those stories before, but out there in the dark with that black Freightliner stalking me, I wasn't laughing. The road between Boise City and Guymon is one of the emptiest stretches I've ever driven. No big towns, no rest areas with cameras, just long stretches of asphalt with fields and the occasional farmhouse far off in the distance. I knew if I pulled over, I'd be completely alone. About 11 p.m., I passed through Gaimon. For a moment, I felt relief. Lights, gas stations, signs of life. Maybe he'd peel off here, but no. He stayed with me through town. Smooth as ever. Not gaining, not falling back. Once we cleared Gaimon and the darkness swallowed us again, I started sweating through my shirt even though the AC was blasting. And then it got worse. Every time I glanced in my mirror, I swore I saw tiny flickers inside his cab. Not headlights, not reflections. More like movement, like someone shifting from the driver's seat to the passenger side. Once I thought I caught the outline of another face in the passenger window, just for a second before the road dipped and the angle was lost. The paranoia crept in harder. My brain kept playing with me. What if there were 3 of them? What if they were waiting for me to pull into a stop so they could surround my rig before I even got the chance to lock the doors? I rolled the window down a few inches, listening. At first, nothing but wind. Then, maybe my imagination, maybe not. I heard a faint hum, not from my engine. A deeper vibration, almost like a generator running inside his trailer. It rose and fell in odd intervals, like a machine cycling through something. That sound got under my skin in a way I can't explain. Made me feel like I wasn't just being followed, I was being hunted. That's when I remembered the dash cam my sister had given me for Christmas. Dual lens, front and rear. I usually kept it running, but never thought much about it. I checked the little red light, still recording. At least if something happened, there'd be a record. That gave me a tiny bit of comfort. Just after midnight, I hit a stretch where 287 curves near an old industrial site. As I rounded the bend, my mirrors finally caught the trailer of the black rig at a slight angle. No markings, no plate visible, just plain metal with faint streaks of grime. The cab windows were so darkly tinted they looked painted black. And that's when I noticed it. A faint red glow on the dashboard. A single LED light, small but sharp, like an eye watching. I don't know why, but that detail rattled me more than anything else. I drove another 20 minutes with my pulse hammering, every muscle tense. By then I was rehearsing escape plans in my head. Could I pull into a station and run inside before they cornered me? Could I double back onto a side road? Or would they force me off the road in the dark, like I'd heard in those stories? About 20 minutes later, I spotted a rest area sign. Just a tiny lot with a bathroom and a couple of picnic tables. Maybe 5 miles ahead. My first instinct was not to stop, too isolated. But then I thought maybe I could use it to my advantage. If I pulled in suddenly, maybe I'd force him to reveal his intentions. At the last second, I swerved toward the exit without signaling. My tires squealed as I took the ramp too fast. Behind me, the black Freightliner's brakes shrieked, but he managed to follow. My headlights swept across the empty lot. No cars, no trucks, just cracked pavement under buzzing floodlights. I pulled in nose first, engine idling, and positioned myself facing the exit so I could bolt. Seconds later, he rolled in behind me, stopped about 50 feet back, engine rumbling low. We sat there like that for maybe 5 minutes. Neither of us is moving. I could see the shadow of a figure in his driver's seat, but no details. The tinted glass made it impossible. Then I saw something that froze me. A second shadow shifted from the sleeper berth to the passenger seat. There were 2 of them. My hand tightened on the gear shift, ready to gun it if either door opened. Suddenly, my CB crackled to life, not with voices, just clicking. Rhythmic, deliberate, over and over for 30 seconds. Then silence. It didn't sound like interference. It sounded like a code. That's when I saw new headlights cresting the hill behind us. Blue and red lights followed. An Oklahoma Highway Patrol cruiser. I almost cried with relief. I flashed my high beams and hit my air horn 3 times. The universal distress signal. The trooper pulled in fast, positioning himself between me and the black rig. His spotlight lit up the Freightliner's cab. He approached their window, hand on his weapon. I watched him talk with whoever was inside. The window rolled down just a crack. They spoke for maybe 2 minutes. The trooper circled the truck, shining his flashlight on the cab and trailer. He even snapped pictures of the back before coming over to me. He asked if I was okay. I told him everything. The stalking, the mirrored signals, the intimidation. He listened carefully, nodded, and said I wasn't the first. According to him, 2 other drivers had reported a similar black rig on this same stretch in the past 3 weeks. Both claimed they'd been followed for hours. One said he'd been forced onto a dirt road before the truck sped off when locals showed up. The other reported an attempted hijacking near Woodward, Oklahoma. The trooper told me the plates on this one came back to a shell company that didn't exist. He suspected it was part of a cargo theft ring, professional, organized, and dangerous. Backup arrived within 15 minutes. 2 more patrol cars boxed in the black rig. Weapons drawn. They ordered the occupants out. I'll never forget seeing the 2 men step out. One was tall, lean, and wearing a black hoodie. The other was shorter, thick-set, with a shaved head. Both looked calm, almost smug. Like this was just a temporary inconvenience. The officers cuffed them and began searching the cab. A few minutes later, one of the troopers came back holding a black notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten notes. Truck routes, license plates, driver names, even addresses. My name was in there. So was my Tulsa destination. Even notes about my habits, what rest stops I usually used, how often I fueled. They'd been watching me for a while. The trailer, when opened, held nothing but burglary tools. Bolt cutters, crowbars, electronic jammers. They were prepared to disable GPS trackers and strip loads quickly. The investigation took hours. They copied my dashcam footage, took my statement, and told me these men were connected to a larger ring stretching across several states. Dozens of thefts. At least 4 drivers are still missing. I left that rest area around 4 a.m. under police escort. My legs were shaking the whole way to Tulsa. When I finally got home that weekend, I hugged my sister and swore I'd take a break, but I know I'll be back out there eventually. Trucking's in my blood. Still, every time I see headlights appear in my mirror on an empty stretch of road, my heart races. And if it's a black Freightliner with no markings, I don't wait around to find out. For 3 straight hours, rain pounded my windshield, while I eased a loaded rig through the Wasatch at night. The wipers could barely keep up. Water sheets smeared the glass whenever a gust hit the cab wrong, and the spray from the trailer tossed back onto me on every downhill. I kept the heater on defrost and the air just cool enough to stay alert. This run was supposed to be simple, medical packaging out of Albuquerque, bound for a distribution center outside Ogden. The quickest path put me on US 6 through Spanish Fork Canyon, and then up toward Provo. I've driven trucks for close to 15 years. I don't scare easily behind the wheel, and I know when to slow, when to gear down, and when to take a pull-off rather than fight a storm. That Thursday in September, I thought I was making the right calls. My name's Mark Reynolds. I'm 45, divorced, no kids. My sister lives in West Jordan. I crash on her couch every few weeks when a route runs me up here. She'd texted earlier to say she left a casserole in her fridge for me to reheat when I finished. I remember staring at that text during a lull at a truck stop outside Helper, wishing I was already done and sitting in a quiet kitchen instead of crawling along a black ribbon carved into mountains. The load was heavy, just under 78,000 gross, and the road was slick. The CB was mostly static. A couple of drivers mumbled about hydroplaning near Price. Then the channel went dead again. Traffic was light. Most sane people weren't trying to beat a deadline on a night like that. I kept her at 35 through the tight stuff, shifted low before each turn, and watched the trailer in the mirrors like a hawk. There's a bend in that canyon locals call Widow's Switch. State signs mark it as a curve with a speed advisory, but anyone who runs this route knows it's a problem in the weather. To the right, sheer rock wall dark as a cliff face. To the left, guardrail and then empty air, a drop into black pines. Rain makes it worse. The grade leans right as the road swings left, and your trailer wants to float if you brake wrong. I was thinking about that lean when my headlights picked up 3 forms dead center in my lane. They were small. Knee-high rain pooled around rubber boots. Yellow slickers glared back at me under the beams. The hoods bowed so low I couldn't see faces. They stood shoulder to shoulder, not moving, not even flinching as 40 tons of truck came at them. No shuffle, no turn of the head, nothing human about their reaction, or lack of one. I pressed the brakes hard enough to scrub speed without locking them, feathered them, steered to give myself a few more feet, and felt the trailer slide a fraction as it tried to push the cab. The rails screamed under the strain. The wheel went light for a heartbeat while the weight shifted. I threaded the space between the rock and those yellow shapes. Horn roaring, my breath stuck somewhere too shallow to be useful. When I cleared the bend, my hands were trembling on the wheel. There was a tiny turnout ahead, really just a widened shoulder cut into the hillside. I put on the hazards and crawled into it, fighting for traction in the standing water. The rig angled. Not pretty, but safe enough. I got it stopped, grabbed my flashlight and phone, and stepped into the downpour. The cold hit like a slap. I dialed 911 as I jogged back along the guardrail. US Highway 6, I told the dispatcher when she answered. Northbound, just past mile marker 67, the curve locals call Widow's Switch. There are kids in the road, 3 of them in yellow raincoats. She told me to get back in my truck, to stay inside with the doors locked. I said I couldn't leave the children in the lane. She started asking for descriptions, ages, whether anyone was injured, and whether there were other cars. I gave what I could while rain ran into my collar and my boots filled up with cold water at each step. When I reached the spot where I'd seen them, my flashlight beam slid across empty pavement. No raincoats, no small shoes, only fresh runoff carving thin rivulets along the paint lines, and the black scrape of my own tires swinging wide. I climbed the embankment to check the trees. The beam stuttered off soaked spruce and scrub juniper. No footprints on the muddy shoulder. I called out, "Hey, hey, you need help?" My voice vanished in the hiss of rain and the engine noise from my idling truck. Headlights bloomed behind me 10 minutes later. A Utah Highway Patrol cruiser pulled in ahead of my rig. The officer who stepped out was mid-30s, compact in his rain gear, with a hat brim stacked with water. "Trooper Eli Navarro," he said as he approached. "You the caller?" I nodded, told him everything exactly as it happened. He asked me to walk him through where I saw them, where I braked, and where I pulled over. He crouched to photograph the skid marks, the scored lines near the center. He asked, "Could you see faces?" "No," I said. "The hoods were down, they didn't look up." "That's what everyone says," he muttered, more to himself than to me. He pointed his flashlight at the inside of the guardrail, where the paint had a long scuff. "You were close," he said. "Another foot and you'd have kissed steel." He led me back to my trailer and directed his light at the doors. "Humor me," he said. "You lock and seal at pickup?" "Always," I said, moving to show him the tag. The blue plastic seal was intact, but scratches scarred the metal around the hasp. "Those are fresh," he said, tapping with a pen. "We've been getting reports. Whoever's been setting these up uses the panic to crack trailers if they can." "Excuse me, whoever's been setting what up?" Trooper Navarro looked at me for a long second, water drumming on his hat. Then he took out a small spiral notebook from an inner pocket and flipped it open. The pages were covered with dates and mile markers. "We've had 9 calls in 2 years at this curve," he said. "Always in bad weather. Always 3 in yellow slickers. Always vanish before anyone else can verify." "That's not," I began, and then stopped. "So it's not just me." He shook his head. 4 crashes too, 2 over the rail. We pulled a guy out last winter who survived long enough to tell us what he swerved for. Same description you just gave. Navarro glanced up canyon where the curve disappeared into a gray wall. After the 3rd, we put DOT cameras just beyond both approaches. A month ago, around 2:10 a.m., one camera caught a white panel van nosing into the gravel on that blind side. He angled his phone against the rain to show me an image. It was grainy and wet-streaked, but clear enough. A long van, bumper dented, no plates on the front. 2 figures in dark coats hauled something out of the back. He swiped to the next frame. 3 child-sized shapes in rain gear, positioned exactly where I'd just blown past. He zoomed in on the hoods. You could see the rigid lines under the fabric. No faces, just smooth ovals. "Mannequins," he said, weighted at the feet. "Coats made with retro-reflective tape, so your headlights punch them out of the dark. You round the bend, you see kids. You do what any human being does. You try not to hit them. They plan the placement to force a bad choice." "Why?" I asked, though my hands had already gone to the trailer lock as if the answer were there in the scratches. "Cargo theft, most likely," Navarro said. "Sometimes insurance fraud. We've found pry marks on 2 trailers that crashed. Those drivers didn't make it. We couldn't ask questions." He looked at me again. "Your seal didn't break, so you got lucky." Before I could answer, a low engine note rolled down the canyon, building like thunder. Another truck was climbing toward us. Navarro snapped a quick call over the radio, asking nearest units to slow traffic on both sides. There weren't many units to call. The weather had roads stacked with calls and stretched the night shift thin. He bolted to his cruiser and lit everything. Light bar, alley lights, takedowns. The canyon exploded with white-blue pulses. I ran to my cab, grabbed emergency flares, struck them one after another until my fingers burned, and tossed them down the center line leading into the curve. The sound of a jake brake hammered down from the darkness, hard, chattering. A tractor came into view, hugging the inside, rain pouring off its visor. It stopped short of our flares. The window rolled down, and a woman in her 50s leaned out, gray hair twisted in a band at the nape of her neck, rain beads on her cheeks. "Did you see them?" she called, voice shaking. "3 little ones in yellow, about 2 miles back, standing near the pull-off." Navarro and I looked at each other. He walked up to her step and asked for the location details. She gave a decent marker and described the turnout. He turned back to his radio, asked for any available unit to sweep the pull-off below for a white van. While he talked, the woman, she said her name was Ruth Delgado, kept looking down canyon like the dark would spit those slickers back out. Dispatch came over his shoulder with a new report. A motorist had just phoned in a white panel van, leaving a dirt service road that paralleled the highway. The caller caught a partial plate before the rain hit it. The van was headed toward the valley. There was an old way station down there, decommissioned. If someone needed cover for a few minutes to pull equipment or ditch something, that lot would do. Navarro made a quick decision. He told me to stay with my rig, or follow at a distance if I had to move. He told Ruth to tuck behind me and use her hazards. Then he pulled out, and we fell into a small convoy, his cruiser, my truck, Ruth's rig, slinking down grades, slick enough to make your stomach clench. We reached the way station in about 10 minutes. The buildings were dark, the roofline sagging, and tumbleweeds were piled in fences like nests. Navarro swung into the cracked asphalt, circled behind the cinderblock office, and his headlights washed over a white van parked nose-in toward a retaining wall. Steam curled from the grill. The engine had been shut down seconds ago. He blocked the exit with his cruiser and was out with his weapon, up before my brakes finished sighing. He called out commands. No one answered. He approached the driver's door, yanked it. Open. Empty. He swept the cargo doors. They were wide, and the interior was a mess of plastic and rainwater and gear. Inside the van, 3 child-sized mannequins in yellow slickers lay stacked, the shiny fabric drenched. Their heads were smooth blanks under the hoods. A 4th mannequin wore a reflective vest. Bundles of rope, rubber bases, and rebar anchor stakes were in milk crates nearby. A battery bank fed a scanner still hissing open channels. A box held bolt cutters, pry bars, cordless impact drivers, flat wedges, and tamper-proof bit sets. A cheap GPS jammer sat taped under a shelf, still warm to the touch. Navarro radioed for backup, then for a K9 unit. He put on gloves and moved a small black notebook from the passenger seat into a plastic bag. I could see lines of handwriting inside, even through the rain-blurred plastic. He slid it out enough to read a page without touching the paper. Routes, dates, vehicle descriptions, names where they could get them. My name stopped me cold. Reynolds. Mark. ABQ to Ogden. Medical pack, it read in neat block letters. Prefers US 6 at night when the weather is clear. Fuel stop options. Price, helper. Typical pull-offs used when tired. East of Tucker, south of Diamond Fork. There was an arrow drawn to tonight's date, and a small note. Rain, curve. Navarro looked up at me like he knew the cold needle that ran from my neck to my gut. "They've been watching," he said. "Not just you, a lot of you." He flipped to the back. A fold-out map of Utah and parts of Nevada was taped across 2 pages. Red marks dotted mountain passes. Some were circled with what looked like codes next to them. Under that, another sheet showed long-haul routes into Idaho and Oregon. We heard voices first, other troopers rolling in, then dogs, then somebody from the county. The next hours fuzzed into the kind of cold, wet, waiting anyone who's ever stood on a shoulder and weather knows by heart. They swept the scrub and the creek bed that ran behind the way station. Footprints led to the water. After that, nothing. Whoever had driven that van knew to use the wash to lose scent and knew where to climb out downstream. The rain took care of the rest. By morning, the FBI had a couple of agents on site. They took statements while we stood under the way station overhang, sipping bad coffee from someone's thermos. They asked me to recount every second from the first sight of yellow to the last. They listened without blinking. I watched their eyes when Navarro handed over the notebook. I saw the way they tracked the page marks like people recognizing patterns too big to say out loud without proof. An agent named Pierce, early 40s, rain jacket neat, even after hours in it, told us there had been similar setups in Idaho and eastern Oregon over the last year. Variations on a theme. Sometimes they used deer decoys and bright reflective tape. Sometimes the figures were men in hooded ponchos pretending to limp. Panic on a blind curve was the constant. The goal was always the cargo. We walked back to my trailer, and checked the doors again in daylight. The scratches around the hasp showed clean metal through the paint. Tried and interrupted, Pierce said. Typical, when the driver stops and someone else arrives faster than they expect. Ruth gave her statement too. She had wiry strength to her, the kind of driver who'd manage crews and routes and weather longer than I'd been in a cab. She kept shaking her head as she spoke. Kids, she said. They know no one will keep driving at kids. Trooper Navarro gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered any details later. He told me to take it slow into the valley and get my seals rechecked at the DC before I left the yard. He said they'd keep patrols heavy on 6 for a while and would put out an alert to truckers about the mannequin scheme. The FBI said there'd be a follow-up and maybe a grand jury if they tied this van to a crew working interstate. Everyone used words like organized, ring, and ongoing. I rolled into Ogden a day late. My dispatcher didn't yell. By the time I parked at the dock, he'd already heard pieces of it from other drivers and from a safety bulletin the company blasted out that morning. They told us to install secondary door bars and upgraded seals, to set dash cams to archive clips when we hit our brakes hard enough to trigger the G-force sensors, to never get out of the cab on a blind curve unless we could see the whole scene, and to call first, second, and third before we moved. When I finally reached my sister's place, I carried that reheated casserole to the table and didn't even put it on a plate. She asked what was wrong. I told her what I could without making her worry. Every night I climbed into a cab again. She hugged me the way only a big sister can. That night I slept hard and woke to rain tapping her windows. And for half a second I thought I was still in the canyon with the light bar bouncing off wet rock and 3 yellow hoods in a lane where no one should ever stand. I still run that route. You can't avoid every bend in a job like this. But I slow for Widow's Switch even on bright afternoons. I watch the mirrors harder. I check the doors at every stop. And sometimes, when a storm rolls over the ridge and the road turns into gray glass and the mountain breathes mist into the cut, I see something small at the edge of the beam and every muscle in me goes tight. They installed more cameras after that night. DOT put up signs warning of traffic incidents. Highway Patrol changed their overnight patrol schedule, so a unit swings through at the worst hours. The company pushed new training. The FBI never told me if they caught the crew that used that van. Maybe they did. Maybe the crew moved 2 states over and changed the angle of the grift. My dash cam caught a lot of that night. You can hear the horn in my breath and the growl of the Jake brake and see the wet sheen of the curve. When the headlights sweep the lane, 3 bright shapes flare and then vanish beyond the edge of the frame. The image is ugly, rain and glare and motion, but you can see enough. I keep that clip backed up on my phone and in the cloud. Not because I want to relive it, because sometimes a guy at a counter somewhere will laugh when you mention people using props to make you crash, and it helps to have proof. I've told this story to other drivers at petro counters and picnic tables behind tire shops and in the line at scale houses. Most nod before I'm done. You can tell who's had their own close call by how they look at the floor during the part where the trailer slides. Somebody always asks if I believe in ghosts. I don't. I believe in people with equipment and a plan, and the willingness to make a stranger choose wrong at the worst possible spot. The last time I climbed past that curve in daylight, the guardrail gleamed new where mine had kissed paint that night. Someone had left 3 yellow rain ponchos folded on the mile marker, like a joke or a warning. Maybe a trooper put them there to remind the next driver to be careful. Maybe a driver did it and hoped the crew saw and moved on. I don't know. I just know I slowed to a crawl, checked my mirrors twice, and gave myself more room than the sign asked for. And when the road straightened and the canyon opened and the radio came back to life with the scratched laughter of a couple of drivers talking about nothing at all, it felt like breathing after a long time underwater. Then the rain picked up again, and the mountains swallowed the sound, and I kept moving.